Good day, ECO231 students, and welcome to week 11. This week we will continue with chapter 10, Market Power, Monopoly and Monopsony. Now, last week we did Monopoly and Monopoly Power. This week we'll look at the sources of monopoly power, monopsony, and monopsony power. Remember, sections 10.4 and 10.7 is not prescribed. These sections you build on in your third year of microeconomics. And then also the rule of thumb for pricing, the multi-plan firm, and learner index are not included in your chapter 10. So those particular sections are also excluded from 10.1 and 10.2. So we'll continue with sources of monopoly power. So although we did not discuss the measurement of monopoly power using the equation 10.4, that was in sections 10.1 and 10.2, it is important to know what monopoly power is and what are the sources of monopoly power. So to quickly recall what monopoly power is, that is the firm's ability to set its price above marginal cost. Remember, for the perfectly competitive firm, price equals marginal revenue, which equals marginal cost. But for monopoly power, or for market power for that matter, there is this ability to affect the price. So equation 10.4 also showed that where there was less elastic demand curves, so a more inelastic demand curve, the more monopoly power a firm had. So recall that example regarding the toothbrushes. That was figure 10.7. That reflected how the elasticity of the demand curve could also affect the monopoly power a particular firm has. So there are three main factors or determining factors that affect the firm's elasticity of demand. So that is the elasticity of market demand, right? Then there is the number of firms in the market. And lastly, the interaction amongst the firms. So, yes, we are speaking about the firm's elasticity of demand, but in terms of the factors that determine the firm's elasticity of demand, we need to reflect on, first of all, the market demand's elasticity. So, firstly, the firm's own demand will be at least as elastic as the market demand. So that elasticity of the market demand, it places a limit or constraint on the potential for monopoly power. Then, if you reflect on the number of firms in the market, so remember, with a perfectly competitive market, there are many firms. So in that scenario, it is unlikely that any firm has the ability to affect the price significantly. So of course, when we reflected on monopoly, we know that there is one firm, but pure monopolies are really rare. So very often you might find that there are just a few firms, but the more firms that there are, the reduced likelihood that any one particular firm can then affect the price significantly. And then also, it comes down to the interaction of those firms. So let's say you have 2 or 3 or 4 firms in the market, but the rivalry amongst them is quite aggressive. So each firm is trying to capture as much of the market as they possibly can. So the resulting impact is that each firm then is unable to profitably raise the price very much because that rivalry amongst them is quite aggressive. So hence the interaction amongst firms is also quite important. Now we'll look at each of these factors individually. As the notes are quite extensive on these 3 factors, please also spend the time reading through it. So first of all, if there is only one firm, you know that that is a pure monopolist, then you saw from the start of chapter 10 that its demand curve is the market demand curve. the market demand is that demand curve for the pure monopolist. So as we said that the firm's elasticity of demand comes down to the elasticity of market demand. For a pure monopolist, the firm's degree of monopoly power depends completely on the elasticity of market demand because its demand curve is the market demand curve. However, when you have a number of firms competing with one another, as you saw in that toothbrush example, then the elasticity of the market demand places a lower limit on the magnitude of the elasticity of demand for each firm. So remember, in that example, the elasticity of market demand was minus 1.5, but then several firms, their own elasticity for the demand curves was around -6. So that lower limit was placed by the elasticity of the market demand curve. So a particular firm's elasticity then depends on how those firms compete with one another, and the elasticity of the market demand places a limit on that potential monopoly power. So here's a nice example about OPEC. So, because the demand for oil is fairly inelastic, at least in the short run, OPEC was able to raise oil prices far above marginal production cost in the 70s and early 80s. So, because of that, they could reap those rewards. They had that monopoly power. But if you think about other commodities such as coffee, tin, copper, they are more elastic. So those producers can't really catalyze those markets and raise prices as such. And when they have for the most part failed. So here the elasticity of market demand limits the potential monopoly power that producers could have. Okay, think about our demand for petrol or for diesel. Even if the prices go up greatly in the short run, because our demand for it, the market demand is inelastic, we still purchase that diesel or that petrol. But in the long run, of course, you'd find that the market demand becomes more elastic because we can adjust our purchasing decisions. The next factor deals with the number of firms. So, other things being equal, ceteris paribus, the monopoly power of each firm will fall as the number of firms increases. So, the more firms you have in a market, the lesser the extent of the monopoly power. However, when you only have a few firms accounting for most of the sales in a market, then we say the market is highly concentrated. So, yes, you could have a good number of firms, but let's say there are 3 or 4 firms that make up most of the sales in a particular market. Then part of a firm's competitive strategy could be that they try to create barriers to entry. So even from first year, you should recall what barriers to entry are. It tries to create conditions that makes it difficult for new firms to enter. So, for instance, if government has to grant firms licenses to operate, if you have a license but some other firm can't enter because they don't have a license, that may then extend the market power to that particular firm. So there are some natural barriers to entry. Those are things like patents, copyrights, and licenses, like I spoke about. Then there's also economies of scale. Now, from chapter 7, you should know what economies of scale is all about. So it may make it too costly for more than a few firms to supply the entire market. So in some cases, economies of scale may be so large that it's more efficient for a single firm to operate and supply the entire market. And that is what is called a natural monopoly. The final factor is the interaction amongst firms. So firms might compete aggressively, so they try to undercut one another's prices so that they can capture more of the market share, or they may not compete that much. So in your third year, you learn about competitive strategy of firms in your ECO331 microeconomics for those of you that may want to continue. So they could even collude. Now, very often, you know that collusion is it goes against the Competition Act and competition policy here in South Africa. Here they speak about antitrust laws because, of course, this is an American textbook. But we do have competition policy here in South Africa. There is the Competition Act. There is even Econex. They are researchers that are based at Stellenbosch that look into competition amongst firms. And of course, that is illegal if firms do collude in terms of setting prices. They may agree to limit output or they all raise their prices. Now, a few things to remember here is that a firm's monopoly power is something that is dynamic. Now, when I say dynamic, it means it can change over time. It's not static. So its operating conditions, the market demand, the cost, its behavior, the competitors' behavior, that all changes. So think about monopoly power as something that is dynamic and often changes over time. Also, in terms of real or potential monopoly power in the short run, remember if firms make those short run profits, large short run profits, it tends to induce new firms to enter the industry and thereby it reduces the monopoly power over the longer term. So, real or potential monopoly power in the short run can, in fact, make an industry more competitive in the long run. Other things being equal, the monopoly power is smaller when firms compete aggressively, as is mentioned earlier, and larger when they cooperate. Remember that collusion and how we actually have the Competition Act that prohibits the cooperation in terms of them agreeing about either setting prices similarly or limiting their output. We now turn our attention to monopsony. Okay, so just note the difference in the spelling. So monopsony, it looks at the buyer side. And we are going to see that buyers too can have market power and use it to their advantage. Now, a monopsony is a market where there's only one buyer, whereas oligopsony is a market with a few buyers. Now, with this, it's possible for monopsony power to arise, just like you could have monopoly power for the monopolist. But here, it is the buyer who can affect the price. So the buyer is able to purchase a good at a lower price than the competitive market price. And there are a few concepts that we need to define before our subsequent analysis using figures, and that is marginal value, marginal expenditure, and average expenditure. Now, again, whenever you hear the word marginal, you think there's something extra, something additional when there's a change in one. So, marginal value is that additional value or benefit from buying one more unit of a good. Now, the relationship between marginal value of a good and that relationship is between that of the quantity bought. So, the marginal value you get from each unit bought, it falls as the total amount of the good increases. Think about it like utility. The more of the good you consume, the more the marginal utility begins to fall. So marginal value, it's also the schedule of the demand curve, and it relates to this idea as the more you get from each unit bought, the marginal value would fall. Now, there is also the extra cost of buying each unit, and that is referred to as the marginal expenditure. So, the marginal expenditure is going to depend on if the buyer has monopsony power or is just a competitive buyer who would be a price taker. And then lastly, the average expenditure is the price paid per unit of the good. You think of your total expenditure divided by the number or the total quantity. So the average expenditure is the price paid per unit of the good. So we'll continue part 2 by looking at figure 10.13 in the next narrated audio.